that chair that's on the platform there. And it says that on this little board here, that in 1708, when it was made, it cost £33 Scots, 13 merks. Anybody wonder, or do you wonder what the ratio was? Well, the ratio was £2.75 for that chair. But that chair, when we restored it in 2002, it was restored, and it cost £7,000. But let me just tell you a little incident of it. You'll see that that's the original colour of the chair, and when it was stripped, there was nothing in that centre part, the brown part, and the gentleman who was entitled to be the man dealing with the tapestry and things of this kind, he said to me, "What do you want on the chair, Mr. Horn?" I said, "Well, there's another 2 chairs up there, and they've been done in leather. I think we should get it done in leather." So he went away, searched around for leather works and suppliers, and he got one. And he got a very interesting thing from the owners of the factory that he contacted. And this chair was made in 1708. And right down in the corner, the southwest corner of England, there was a leather factory that had been built and used very much down there, but it had its story. And the story is that in the 1790s, a Russian ship sank off the coast of Cornwall. Nobody bothered about it until round about 1970. And this man wanted to just see if there was anything left of the wreck. And he went down with others, deep sea divers, and they found that there was part of the ship still intact. After all these years, they got a better workers that with the deep sea diving and so forth, and they went down several times, and they discovered that there was a part of the ship that was still intact. And the part of the ship was the hold. And when they got everything cleared and they got access to the hold, they found that the hold was filled with bales of material. And these bales of material were intact. After all these years, and he did something very, very lovely for me, just to justify the thing, and he sent me that. You wonder what that is? That is a piece of Russian leather. And it says on this little thing, salvaged from the wreck of the Meta Katerina. And you're looking at, on the chair, the first grade, and the back of the chair from that leather, and the seating was the second grade of it. And it's a marvellous thing to see how these 2 things, the date of the chair and the date of the sinking and the time that these things came back. I had some American friends here, and I told them that little incident. And one of the ladies came to me and she says, well, Mr. Horn, she says, there's one thing about it. She says, no one could concoct a story like that.
That's absolutely right. Well, thank you so much. It's an interesting place, isn't it? And especially when you hear how it relates to the history of our own, your own church today. I think Pastor Reeder wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I wanted to ask you two questions. Did James Guthrie preach here? Do you know?
I would think he did.
What about
most of the leaders of the Covenanting movement did preach here. This was a focal point of the Covenanters.
Right.
There's very few items that are reserved, but there's one or two very old books going back to the beginning of the 1700s that give the history. And I had a piece of the paper there that had the details, and I don't know where it's gone to, but I'll look one out for another occasion.
Are you talking about James Guthrie in the 1800s?
No, I'm talking about 1600s.
Okay.
James Guthrie. James Guthrie wrote this. I'm actually going over his sermon now for my series that I'm doing on Nahum. He wrote a book called The Wrath of God Upon Nations that have opposed him. And he was preaching that because of the act of uniformity that was taking place and what was happening to the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And then secondly, that was joined with a very significant book that I want to get to, but do you think Samuel Rutherford would have preached here?
Well, Samuel Rutherford was just a little bit ahead of the main part of the Covenanter situation. He was imprisoned up until 1637, and he came back, and he came back to Anwoth, and then he was transferred to St Andrews, and he was involved very much in the university in St Andrews and St Mary's College. And so
he died there probably just a couple of days before he would have been arrested and put to death, as Guthrie was put to death. But Rutherford wrote a key book for all of you that are Americans. He wrote a key book. It was called Lex Rex. Law is king. And so they fought two battles on this. So you've got Knox absorbing in Geneva from Calvin the beginning of the notions of the separation of the church and state. In other words, God put three institutions in place: family, state, and church. They were interdependent, but they were not to be hierarchical. And Calvin had initiated that. And then Knox is bringing it here to another level, and then those who follow Knox, they keep developing it. So they're saying two things. They're saying, number one, no political head of the church. The king cannot be head of the church. Christ is head of his church. And then secondly, in the political realm, the king ought to be the law, not an individual. Lex Rex, the law is king. Now, so let me do this very quickly. We've got a little bit of a schedule here. But now you were just in a renovated cathedral into the kirk where he preached, John Knox, St. Giles. And you see how his pulpit was over on a fluted column, etc., which, by the way, he had moved on purpose. And but now you'll notice, where's the pulpit? Here. Not on the side, it's in the center. In the Reformation, they would do a number of things. I mentioned to you they would take the vestments off of the preachers and robe them with a gown. So that St. Francis of Assisi, who said, preach the gospel, and if necessary use words, he's got a good intent, but in fact it ought to be this: preach the gospel, use words. They're necessary. Because faith comes by hearing. And then So they put the pulpit in the center. What would have been in the center in the cathedral? The altar. Okay? And elevated. And fenced. So that you have to go through the priest to get to the altar. Now you go into the Reformed churches, the pulpit's in the center, not the altar. In fact, you don't find an altar. Why? That's in heaven. Jesus is the altar. You go to Him. You have a communion table, and that table is always on the floor. Always on the floor. If you'll notice, those of you in Briarwood, you'll notice whenever I do communion, I never stand in front of the table, always behind the table. Because you have access to the table. You don't have to come through me to get to the table. Now I have to be there because I have to preach before you come to the table. Why? Because you are spiritually feasting upon Christ by faith. Therefore, the word is always preached before the sacrament. Therefore, you can then come by faith. But the table is on the floor. The pulpit is lifted up, the high pulpit. I'm going to show you some great high pulpits before we leave here. I envy them all. I'd love to be 12 feet above contradiction every time I preach. So you have the elevated pulpit, the table at the floor, and the people around. And that's why when Knox couldn't get to an elevated center pulpit, but he could take the pulpit and put it back to where before the people could not go at St. Giles. Now they could come in and they could hear. Secondly, he learned, remember I told you last night, that what did Calvin, Bootser, Zwingli, all of them do? They came in, the salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. The authority of the Word over the church. And the church is built on the Word, and the Word is over the church. The sufficiency of Scripture. The accessibility of Scripture. So next Lord's Day, you'll have a Bible in your hand. You'll have a hymn book in your hand. And except for the cross of Christ, all the people that you're hearing about, the second largest number of them died for you to have a Bible in your hand and a psalm or a hymn book in your hand, in your language. That's why they died. And so that you could have that Bible in your hand and you could hear it, read it in your language, and hear it preached in your language. That's what they did to accomplish that. And so, so what else did they do? Every one of them would build a school. They would build a school. Every single one of them would build a school. And so that when you come into the city, you had the high pulpit, the church at the center. You had the church supporting the family and working alongside the family and the state. And all of that is developing. Bootser, Zwingli, Calvin, they all church. And then they would build a school to assist the family and the church and the state. They would build a school. The school had two purposes: produce leaders and preachers for the church and provide public education. It's great to have the Gutenberg press, but if you can't read, what good does that do to have something in a pamphlet? So they made education available, male and female. Public education available. And so when Knox comes back here, what does Knox do? Church, preaching, school. He puts it all in place, so they begin that whole movement. Now, thankfully, because of things like the Act of Uniformity, in which Charles II is trying to wipe out the Presbyterians and impose, he's the head of the church, and Anglican worship on the Presbyterians here, and then they're standing against him, against the Act of Uniformity with this solemn league of covenant that they're standing against them. Then when that's happening, a bunch of Scotsmen are going to have to leave. Guess where they're going to go? America. So, I do lectures on the Civil War, Northern and Southern, by the way. But the Southern Army was 65% Scots-Irish Presbyterians. In fact, the Northern Army would always talk about hearing the Southerners come into battle singing the Psalms. while they would sing them coming into battle. And so you had all of this, but way before that, you get these guys coming. When they land in America, what's the first thing they do? What's the first thing they do? Build a church. What's the next thing they do? Build a school. Harvard was in place before there was a food supply in Boston. Next thing they do is build a school. Then they'd build a courthouse. Family was then drawn upon with school. There's a three-legged school, the three-legged stool. Those three things would be put there. Now, let me ask you a question. Do we still build communities today? Sure we do. I can take you to all kinds of communities. Most of them gated. What's the first thing we build in those communities? Clubhouse. Now you see the culture. They didn't build a clubhouse first. Built a church. Then they built a school. They had learned that from the Reformation. Then, when they start putting together our Constitution, and in just a day or so, we're going to be celebrating what? When the Declaration of Independence was written, they come over here and they read it in the English Parliament. And a parliamentarian stands up in the English Parliament and he says this: Cousin Virginia has just run off with a Presbyterian parson. Now, by the way, they were speaking of somebody very specific, Jonathan Witherspoon. 13 of those men that were working in that Continental Congress had studied under Jonathan Witherspoon, and he also was a delegate. So it's no accident when he is influencing men like Madison and Mason, George Mason and James Madison, who studied under him. There's no accident that you then have something very unique. You live in the only country where the government borrowed its system of government from the church. With all due respect to my Anglican friends, what you've got there is a form of government that was defined by the form. You have a church government defined by the state government. It mirrors it, the whole system. What you have in the Presbyterian is the Presbyterians go over there and they say, hey, everybody ought to be accountable to somebody. You ought to have a system of appeals. They just borrowed the local church, presbytery, General Assembly concept with checks and balances and all those things, and James Madison puts it into a concept of government. And guys, the number one book they used to develop that Constitution and our form of government, the number one book they used likely was read right here. Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex. The law is king. So when the Bible tells you as an American that you are to be submissive to Caesar, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and you go back to America, who is Caesar in America? It's not President Obama. It's the Constitution. Every person elected takes an oath of submission to what? The Constitution. Everybody that enters the military, everybody that enters into government, you're right. You're right in the place where that stuff was birthed and sent to you. That's effective. You're sitting right here in the midst of it. This is where, particularly in that second round of the Reformation, when Charles II is striking back and striking against the Reform movement in Scotland, when he is striking back, and they then take this stand, Guthrie and Samuel Rutherford, and these men, they stand there and they write and they preach. Those very things were used by your forefathers that took them at the same time over across the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore that's what ultimately gives you your country. You just needed one more thing. We needed a great awakening. And then you're going to go sit where that came from. Pembroke College, Oxford, where George Whitefield was studying. And when he came over and began to preach, that lit the Great Awakening from 1735 to 1765 that built upon what the Reformation had sent over in the 17th and 18th centuries. And that's what gives you your country in the providence of God. So you can trace it from Geneva right here to this chapel, down to Oxford, from Cambridge. You can see all of those things and what it brought over, and it's lit by the Great Awakening and moves forward from there. So we'll keep talking some more about it, but I didn't want to let that pass while we're sitting here, which is this is the seat of the Covenanters. Now there's a wonderful book written by a guy by the name of Smiley, I think that's the way you pronounce it, called The Covenanters, where he recounts their lives, their testimony, what it cost them, their martyrdom. It's called Men of the Covenant. And by the way, there are a number of ladies that die in it too. So
We'll see it in Sterling.
And we'll see that at Sterling. I'll show you a couple of places there. And you'll find, as it says here, a number of women. I think it was 45 women signed
The National Covenant?
the National Covenant. I think it was. It was 300. I think it was 300 or something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers. But we'll keep working. We'll go over to the cemetery over there and talk a little bit more about it. But I wanted to do it here. It's a little bit warmer. I don't know what the weather's going to be out there. And I wanted to get that to you here as well. So,
Could I just say one word in closing?
Yes.
A lot of people get the impression that when we're talking about the reformers and the Covenanters and so on, that they were unusual people. Every time I hear somebody bringing in that criticism, I just turn to the words of Samuel Rutherford. You've been talking about Samuel Rutherford, and Samuel Rutherford had some very wonderful sayings, and he says, and Mrs. Cousins has put it into verse, "Fair Anwoth by the Solway, to me thou still art dear, e'en from the verge of heaven I drop for thee a tear. Oh, if one soul from Anwoth meet me at God's right hand, my heaven will be two heavens in Emmanuel."